Judge mocks black teen girl's speech, shocked when she destroys the system and makes history. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom groaned open, and a rush of hushed whispers filled the space. Emily Taylor stepped inside, her presence instantly swallowed by the oppressive weight of the room. The scent of old paper, polished oak, and something colder, like anticipation laced with malice, hung in the air. Hundreds of eyes turned to her, some filled with amusement, others with outright hostility. She was just 16, but she was standing here alone, facing a system that had never lost to someone like her. At the center of it all, seated high on his bench, was Judge Harold Carver. His presence was a monument to the old ways, gray-haired, stern-faced, and radiating the authority of a man who had long since decided that justice was a game only certain people were allowed to play. He adjusted his glasses with slow deliberation, his lips curling slightly at the sight of her. Then in a voice dripping with condescension, he said, "Let me get this straight." His fingers drummed against the thick file in front of him before his gaze returned to her, sharp and patronizing. "A high school student is here to argue constitutional law in my courtroom?" Laughter rippled through the audience like the first cracks in a dam. First low, then growing louder, spreading through the rows of suited figures seated behind their gleaming desks. At the defense table, Nancy Whitaker, the school board's lead attorney, exchanged glances with her colleagues, shaking her head in feigned disbelief. She leaned forward, her voice smooth and polished with years of experience. "Miss Taylor, this isn't a high school debate club. Perhaps you've confused this with an extracurricular activity?" More laughter. Emily clenched her fists, nails digging into her palm, but she refused to lower her gaze. She had known this would happen. She had prepared for this moment. And yet, standing here, drowning in the smug amusement of those who had spent their entire lives wielding power like a weapon, she felt the first sharp stab of doubt creep into her chest. The courtroom itself was designed to intimidate. It was grand, towering, a place meant to remind those who entered that justice belonged to the powerful. Dark mahogany walls lined with books that no one like her had ever been allowed to write. Rows of wooden benches filled with reporters eager to document her inevitable failure. The chandeliers above cast a warm glow over the prosecution's table, where Whitaker sat, her expensive suit pristine, her nails meticulously polished. Everything about her screamed control, experience, power. In contrast, Emily stood in a simple navy dress, her hands gripping the podium so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The murmurs around the room continued, a swirling storm of contempt, but she stood her ground. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear despite the pounding of her heart, "I'm not here for a debate. I'm here for justice." The room fell into momentary silence. It was brief, just a flicker of stillness before Whitaker scoffed, shaking her head. "Justice," she repeated mockingly. "And you believe you, a high school junior, are qualified to define what that means in a court of law?" Emily opened her mouth, but before she could respond, the judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling as though indulging a particularly foolish child. "Miss Taylor," he said, shaking his head, "I admire your enthusiasm. But this courtroom isn't the place for grandstanding. The law is complex. It is not a platform for activism disguised as legal argument." Emily felt her pulse hammering in her ears. She wanted to tell him that she had spent the last 6 months buried in case law, that she had memorized constitutional precedents while her peers were at football games, that she had sacrificed sleep, friendships, and peace of mind because she knew that if she failed here, the system would continue crushing people like her. But she also knew that these men, these polished attorneys with their decades of experience and their inherited seats of power, did not care about any of that. Whitaker pushed back from the table, smoothing her blazer as she rose to her feet. "Your Honor," she said, turning to the judge with a practiced smile, "I move to dismiss this case on the grounds that Miss Taylor lacks standing, lacks expertise, and frankly, lacks any real argument worth hearing." The judge sighed, nodding slightly. "A reasonable request," he mused. Then looking back at Emily, he tilted his head. "Do you have a response, Miss Taylor? Or have we wasted enough time here today?" The words stung like a slap, but Emily straightened her shoulders. I do, Your Honor, she said, forcing steel into her voice. I have prepared a legal argument based on constitutional law, case precedent, and civil rights protections. I am not asking for favors. I am asking for my case to be heard, just as it would be if I were represented by an older, white male attorney instead of standing here as a 16-year-old black girl. The murmurs returned, louder this time. A few reporters leaned forward. A flicker of interest sparked in their eyes. Emily saw Whitaker's lips press into a thin line, saw the way her fingers tightened slightly on the papers before her. For the first time, Emily realized she had struck a nerve, but Carver merely sighed again, shaking his head. Miss Taylor, passion is admirable, but this court deals in facts, not sentiment. Now, unless you have something truly groundbreaking to present. 6 months ago, Emily never imagined she would be standing here, facing a courtroom filled with powerful men who had already decided her fate. Back then, she was just another girl watching the world move against her people, feeling the weight of injustice but believing someone else would fight it. Willow Creek was the kind of town that looked peaceful on the surface, the kind of place where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges and white picket fences, where families attended Sunday service at the old brick church and waved to their neighbors from their porches. But underneath that carefully constructed facade, beneath the quiet hum of small-town life, lay an unspoken truth, one that everyone knew but no one dared to say aloud. Willow Creek was not for everyone. For families like the Taylors, the Mitchells, and every other black family in town, the lines had been drawn long ago. They weren't written down, not explicitly, but they were just as real as any law. There were places they could go and places they could not, schools they could attend and schools that would never let them through the door, no matter how hard they tried. And the brightest among them, the ones who dared to dream beyond the limitations imposed upon them, were the ones who suffered the most. Samantha Mitchell was 10 years old, a little girl with big brown eyes, a wide, hopeful smile, and a mind that burned with curiosity. She loved books, loved to learn, and she was smarter than most kids twice her age. She had been reading since she was 4, solving math problems meant for high schoolers by the time she was 8. Her teachers at Jefferson Elementary had run out of ways to challenge her. She needs more, they told her parents, their voices edged with something close to apology. She belongs somewhere she can grow. And there was only one place in Willow Creek where she could grow: Oak Ridge Academy. Oak Ridge was the best school in the district, a private institution disguised as a public one, reserved for the children of doctors, lawyers, and business executives. A place where the curriculum was rigorous, the facilities were state-of-the-art, and the unspoken rule had remained unchanged for decades. Black kids didn't get in. Samantha's parents had done everything right. They filed the paperwork early, met every deadline, provided every necessary document. Her father, Robert Mitchell, had even gone so far as to schedule meetings with the admissions office, presenting Samantha's test scores, her letters of recommendation, every piece of evidence that proved she deserved a spot. They smiled at him, nodded politely, assured him that the process was fair, that every child was given equal consideration. And then, weeks later, when the acceptance letters were sent out, Samantha's name was missing. At first, Robert had assumed there had been a mistake. He had called the office, waited on hold for nearly an hour before finally reaching someone. The voice on the other end of the line had been cold, detached. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell. Unfortunately, Samantha's application did not meet our standards for admission." His stomach twisted. What standards? She scored in the 98th percentile on every assessment. Her teachers wrote glowing recommendations. What exactly was missing? There was a pause, a brief, uncomfortable silence. And then, "I'm afraid I can't discuss specific admissions decisions, sir. The process is final." Click. Just like that, it was over. Robert had driven straight home, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His wife, Angela, had been waiting at the kitchen table, holding the unopened rejection letter in her hands, as if not opening it would change what was inside. "They didn't even consider her," Robert had said, his voice hollow. "They never were going to." Angela had swallowed hard, blinking back the anger in her eyes. "What do we tell her?" They had tried to soften the blow, tried to explain that sometimes things didn't work out, that there were other schools, other opportunities. But Samantha was too smart for that. She had listened, nodding quietly, her little hands curled into fists in her lap. And then, in a small, broken voice, she had asked the one question they couldn't answer. Was it because I'm black? Angela had flinched. Robert had looked away, because they both knew the truth. Emily Taylor had heard the story from her father first. She had been sitting in the living room, flipping through one of his old law books, when she overheard his conversation with Robert. She hadn't meant to listen, but as soon as she heard Samantha's name, she couldn't stop herself. When her father finally hung up, his face was tight with frustration, his hands clenched at his sides. They didn't even give her a chance, he muttered, shaking his head. Emily felt something hot coil inside her. She had seen this happen before. She had seen it happen to kids in her own neighborhood, kids who were just as smart, just as deserving, but who were turned away with the same empty excuses. There's no space in the program. The district boundaries changed this year. Your paperwork wasn't processed in time. It was always something, always a reason, always a lie. The rejection letter lay open on the desk like a death sentence. The words, typed in cold, detached legalese, carried the same weight as a judge's gavel slamming down to end a case before it even began. Motion denied. No further appeal. The ink had barely dried. But for Marcus Taylor, the ruling had been set long before the papers had even reached his hands. He sat motionless in his chair, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting shadows across his face, emphasizing the deep lines carved by years of fighting, losing battles. The room smelled of old paper, ink, and the faint trace of coffee gone stale, remnants of the long nights he had spent here, poring over case law, drafting arguments that no one in power ever cared to hear. His hands rested on the arms of his chair, fingers twitching slightly, as if caught between the urge to crumple the letter into nothingness or let it remain as undeniable proof of yet another defeat. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. They didn't even read it, he muttered, his voice low, bitter. His eyes never left the paper in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. Somewhere in the past, reliving every courtroom where he had stood, every judge who had dismissed his words before he could even finish speaking. They won't even hear us. They never do. Behind him, the floor creaked softly. He knew who it was before she spoke. Dad? Emily stood in the doorway, framed by the dim light from the hallway, her face partially obscured by the darkness of the room. She didn't move closer yet. She was waiting, watching, trying to gauge just how broken he was this time. Marcus let out a sharp breath and leaned back in his chair. It's over. The words sent a chill through her. She had never heard him say that before. Her father was a man who had spent his entire life believing in the fight, in the law, in the idea that truth had power. But now as he sat there, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow, he looked like a man who had finally realized that some fights were never meant to be won. Emily swallowed hard, stepping into the room. What do you mean it's over? Marcus let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. I mean, the court refused to hear the case. They didn't even bother to look at the evidence. They dismissed it before we could get a foot in the door. He picked up the letter and waved it slightly before tossing it back onto the desk. They called it procedural, said there wasn't enough precedent to justify a hearing. Emily's jaw tightened. Procedural. She had heard that word before. It was what they always said when they didn't want to admit the truth, when they didn't want to say outright that people like them didn't get to win. Her father exhaled again, rubbing a hand over his face. I should have known. I should have known they wouldn't let us fight this. The anger in her chest burned hotter. So what? We just give up. Marcus glanced at her then, his eyes heavy. Emily, no, she snapped. You told me the law was supposed to protect us. That justice existed if we fought for it. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to keep going. Was that a lie? He flinched slightly as if the words had cut deeper than she intended, but he didn't answer. That was enough of an answer. Something inside her cracked, but instead of despair, it was something sharper. Anger, determination. If the law wasn't built to protect them, then she would tear it apart and rebuild it herself. She turned sharply, storming out of the room. Marcus called after her, but she didn't stop. She wasn't done yet. Emily didn't sleep that night. She sat at the dining table, surrounded by stacks of legal books, old case files, her father's worn notebooks filled with years of research and failed lawsuits. Her laptop screen glowed in the darkness, illuminating the exhaustion in her eyes, but she didn't stop flipping through pages, scanning documents, searching for something, anything that could give them a way forward. The weight of history pressed against her, suffocating. She read through case after case, each one telling the same story. A black student denied admission, a lawsuit filed, a court refusing to hear it, not enough legal precedent, not strong enough grounds, not worth their time. The pattern was obvious. The system had been designed to keep them out, to bury their voices under mountains of bureaucracy. And her father, he had spent his entire life trying to play by the rules, believing that if he just argued well enough, if he just had the right evidence, they would listen. They never had, and now he was breaking under the weight of it. Emily wasn't going to let them break her too. The clock on the wall ticked, marking the slow creep of dawn. Her fingers ached from flipping pages, her vision blurred from the relentless glow of the screen. She was exhausted, but she kept going. And then, she found it. Her breath caught as she scanned the ruling. A Supreme Court decision, a precedent, a case from decades ago where a student, just like Samantha, had been denied access to an advanced educational program under the same excuses. Procedural error, not enough space, policy restrictions, but this time someone had fought back, and they had won. Emily sat up straighter, heart hammering against her ribs. She reread the ruling, her mind racing through the implications. The arguments were clear, undeniable. The courts had already ruled on this once. If they had set a precedent, then that meant the system wasn't as airtight as they wanted people to believe. This was it. This was their way in. Her fingers trembled as she grabbed her notebook, scribbling furiously, pulling together pieces, connecting dots. She could build a case around this. She could make them listen. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't even out of high school. But that didn't matter. The truth was on her side. She just had to make them see it. A noise behind her made her turn. Marcus stood in the doorway, watching her with tired, wary eyes. "You're still up?" His voice was hoarse, heavy with exhaustion. She didn't look away. "I found something." He frowned slightly, stepping forward. She shoved the file toward him. "Read it." Marcus hesitated, then sat down, flipping through the pages. The room was silent except for the rustle of paper, the distant hum of the refrigerator. Emily watched him closely, barely breathing as he scanned the ruling, as his expression shifted from skepticism to something else, something sharper, more focused. When he finally exhaled, it was slow, measured. He set the file down and looked at her. "This," he shook his head slightly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "This could work." Emily's pulse quickened. "Then we fight." Marcus studied her for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Then finally something in him shifted. For the first time in a long time, she saw it. Hope. He let out a breath and nodded. "All right," he said, voice steadier than before. "Let's get to work." A spark ignited in her chest. This wasn't over. Not even close. This was just the beginning. But finding the legal precedent was only the first step. Winning a case wasn't just about having the right argument. It was about proving you were strong enough to stand in the ring with giants and not flinch. Emily knew the fight ahead would be brutal, but she also knew one thing. She couldn't afford to lose. So with the law on her side and determination burning in her chest, she made her decision. The moment Emily announced she was going to sue the school district, the world around her seemed to stop. The weight of the words hung heavy in the air, echoing in the stunned silence of her kitchen. Her father had stared at her as if she had spoken in a language he couldn't understand. Her mother had frozen, dish towel clenched in her hands, a deep crease forming between her brows. And then, all at once, the room had erupted. "You can't be serious," her father had said, voice tight, weary. "Emily, do you even understand what you're saying?" But she had understood perfectly. She had spent days, nights, weeks reading, learning, dissecting legal arguments, poring over case law until the words blurred together. And in all that time, she had come to one undeniable conclusion. If no one else would fight, then she had to. "They're wrong," she had said, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "And we can prove it." Her father had sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Emily, I've been trying to prove it my entire career. You think one lawsuit is going to change anything?" "You didn't have this," she shot back, shoving the file toward him. "A precedent, a case that won. If they ruled in favor of that student, then the law is on our side." But Marcus only shook his head, his expression unreadable. "Even if you're right, the courts aren't. They'll shut you down before you get a chance to speak." Her mother, silent up until now, finally spoke. "Honey," she said, voice softer but just as firm, "this is dangerous." "I know," Emily said, "but it's more dangerous if we do nothing." Word spread quickly. The town buzzed with disbelief, whispers traveling through grocery store aisles, church pews, and school hallways. "Did you hear? The Taylor girl is suing the school." A high schooler? What is she thinking? They'll eat her alive. Some called her brave. Others called her foolish. And some, her classmates, her so-called friends, called her worse. "You actually think you're going to win?" Maya, her best friend since kindergarten, had asked, incredulous. "Emily, this is Oak Ridge. It doesn't matter what's fair. They make the rules." "They make the rule," Emily had replied, "but that doesn't mean they can't be broken." Maya had just shaken her head, disappointment clouding her features. "You're going to lose everything. Colleges won't touch you after this. They'll label you a troublemaker." Emily had wanted to care, but something in her had shifted. The more people doubted her, the more determined she became. It was time to prepare for battle. Every night, the living room transformed into a courtroom. The coffee table became the judge's bench, stacks of law books piled high. The worn-out couch acted as the jury box, empty save for the ghost of doubt that haunted her father's eyes. And at the center of it all was Emily, standing behind a rickety folding chair that served as her podium, staring down her fiercest opponent, Marcus Taylor. Her father took on every role: judge, jury, prosecution, defense. And every night, he tore her arguments apart. "This is weak," he snapped, tossing her notes onto the table. "If I were the school's attorney, I'd rip you to shreds in under a minute." Emily gritted her teeth, snatching up her papers. "Then I'll make it stronger." "You're quoting precedent, but do you actually understand it?" he pressed. "Explain the ruling in Brown versus Board of Education without reading from your notes." Emily opened her mouth, then hesitated. Marcus smirked. "Exactly. You don't just need to memorize the law, Emily. You need to own it. You need to anticipate every counter-argument before they even make it. If you freeze in that courtroom, they'll eat you alive." Emily clenched her jaw, standing straighter. "Then let's go again." And they did. Night after night, they battled until exhaustion blurred the lines between practice and reality. Marcus played the opposition with ruthless precision, throwing every insult, every sneer, every attempt to discredit her that the real attorneys would. "This is a joke, Your Honor," he spat one night, playing the part of a condescending school attorney. "She's just a child. She doesn't belong here." Emily's fist curled at her sides. "The law doesn't care how old I am," she shot back. "It cares about justice." He leaned in, eyes sharp. "Oh? And what makes you think you can win? You're alone. No legal team, no experience. Just a naive little girl with a folder full of theories." Emily's heart pounded, her breath short, but she refused to falter. "I have facts. I have the law. And I have something none of you have. Truth." Marcus let the silence stretch, watching her. Then, without warning, he slammed his hand against the table, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. Emily flinched but held her ground. Marcus exhaled, leaning back. For the first time in weeks, something in his expression changed. Approval. "You're getting there," he admitted, "but you're not ready yet." And so they continued. She studied harder. She researched deeper. She lived and breathed case law, scouring every angle, every loophole, every single precedent that could give her an edge. She practiced in the mirror, memorizing her responses, training herself not to show doubt. She argued her case at the dinner table, forcing her parents into debates over policy and discrimination until they had no choice but to admit she was making sense. Slowly, painfully, she got better. One night after hours of relentless drilling, her father sat back in his chair, watching her with a strange expression. "You really think you can do this?" he asked. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "I know I can." Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then with a quiet sigh, he nodded. "Then let's make them listen." Something in Emily's chest tightened. He hadn't just said you, he had said we. For the first time since this had started, she wasn't alone. And that changed everything. The first article appeared in the local paper, small, almost forgettable, tucked between news about the mayor's latest initiative and a high school football victory. Local teen challenges school district over alleged discrimination. The headline was cautious, the language restrained, as if the journalist wasn't sure whether to take Emily seriously or treat her as a novelty. But it didn't take long for the story to grow. By the next morning, more outlets had picked it up. High school student takes on education system, a fight for justice? The words spread like wildfire. Soon, reporters were calling, emails flooded in, and camera crews showed up outside the school gates, their lenses trained on the girl who had dared to step into a battle meant for seasoned lawyers and civil rights organizations. At first, Emily hadn't expected it to be this big. She had thought naively that maybe her case would be heard in quiet courtrooms, that her fight would be fought in legal documents and debates behind closed doors. But now the world was watching. She walked the hallways of Jefferson High with 100 pairs of eyes following her, their stares a mixture of admiration, disbelief, and quiet resentment. Some students whispered as she passed, their voices just low enough to sting. "She really thinks she can win. She's just embarrassing herself. She's going to regret this." Even the teachers didn't know what to do with her. Some smiled at her in the way adults do when they think a child doesn't understand the weight of the battle they're fighting. Others avoided her completely, as if acknowledging her would drag them into a war they wanted no part of. And then came the backlash. It started subtly. Parents complaining at school board meetings, news anchors questioning whether she was being manipulated by outside forces. But soon it turned uglier. One night, as Emily sat at the kitchen table, flipping through legal notes with her father, her mother walked in, her face pale as she held out an envelope. No stamp, no return address, just her name scrawled across the front in uneven, jagged letters. Emily took it, her fingers steady even as something cold settled in her stomach. She tore it open, pulled out the single sheet of paper, and read, "Stop now, before it's too late." Her breath caught. Marcus was already reaching for the letter, his expression darkening as he scanned the words. Angela stood frozen, hands clenched, her eyes darting between them. "What the hell is this?" Marcus muttered, gripping the page like he wanted to crush it. Angela's voice trembled. "It was in the mailbox when I got home. No name, no postage." Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep her voice even. "It's just a scare tactic." Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing his hand down his face. "This isn't just some schoolyard prank, Emily. This is a threat." "So what?" she shot back, her pulse pounding. "We stopped fighting because someone wrote a few words on a piece of paper?" Angela's voice was tight. "We don't know who sent it. We don't know what they're capable of." But Emily knew fear was exactly what they wanted. She stood straighter, staring at the paper again. The letters were bold, blocky, written in heavy strokes like the writer had pressed too hard, as if trying to make sure the words carried weight. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. She met her father's gaze. "They wouldn't be scared if we weren't a threat." Marcus hesitated, then let out a slow breath, setting the letter down carefully. His face was unreadable, but something flickered behind his eyes. Something she had seen in the courtroom before, when an opposing attorney had underestimated him. "You're right," he finally said, "but that doesn't mean we get careless." Angela let out a quiet sigh, shaking her head. "We should go to the police." Marcus scoffed. "And tell them what? That someone's trying to intimidate us because my daughter wants justice? They'll throw it in a pile with every other case they don't bother solving." Emily knew he was right. If the law had worked the way it was supposed to, she wouldn't be fighting this battle in the first place. That night she lay awake, the note sitting on her desk like a ghost in the darkness. She wasn't naive. She had always known there would be pushback, but seeing it, feeling the weight of it in her hands, made it real in a way she hadn't been prepared for. Her phone buzzed beside her, a text from an unknown number. "Drop the case. This is your last chance." A chill ran down her spine. She stared at the screen for a long moment before typing her response. "No." Then she turned off her phone, exhaled slowly, and closed her eyes. They wanted her to be afraid. They wanted her to back down. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. She had come too far, fought too hard to walk away now. And so, when the day of the hearing arrived, Emily stepped into that courtroom ready to make them listen. The courtroom was a battlefield, and Emily Taylor stood at its center, unarmed. The walls loomed high, lined with rows of dark mahogany bookshelves filled with laws that had never protected people like her. The air was thick with expectation, the tension crackling like a storm about to break. She could feel it pressing against her skin, suffocating, closing in. But she stood tall, fingers gripping the edges of the podium as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The opposing attorney, Richard Daniels, rose from his seat, adjusting his expensive cufflinks as he took slow, measured steps toward the judge. He didn't even look at Emily as he spoke. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this case is a waste of the court's time." His voice was smooth, polished from years of dismantling cases before they even had a chance to breathe. "We are here because a child has convinced herself that she belongs in a legal setting, but the law does not bend to amateur theatrics." A murmur spread through the courtroom like a ripple of amusement. Daniels turned then, finally looking at Emily, his eyes sharp with condescension. "Miss Taylor is not an attorney. She has no legal expertise, no training, and no business arguing in this courtroom." He gave a small, patronizing smile. "Frankly, I'm not sure if she understands the weight of what she's doing." Laughter, light but cutting, rose from the defense table. Emily's nails dug into her palm. She forced herself to steady her breath. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Daniels." Her voice was strong, but she could hear the tremor beneath it. "The law exists to protect every citizen, not just the ones who can afford a degree." Daniels raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "And yet, Miss Taylor, your case rests on shaky ground. Tell me, do you truly believe that standing here and throwing around passionate rhetoric is enough? That you, without any experience, without a legal team, can overturn a system that has stood for decades?" Emily opened her mouth, but he wasn't done. "You are here, Miss Taylor, not because your argument is sound, but because you crave attention." His tone was sharp now, his words precise, meant to wound. "This is not about justice. This is about a girl who wants to play hero in a fight she doesn't understand." The words hit like a slap. Emily's vision blurred at the edges, the room swaying slightly as the weight of every doubt, every whispered insult, every warning she had ignored came crashing down at once. The judge cleared his throat, an air of impatience clinging to him as he turned to Emily. "Miss Taylor, do you have anything substantial to counter the motion for dismissal?" This was her moment. This was where she was supposed to prove them wrong. She gripped the podium tighter, her prepared arguments flashing through her mind. But they felt like dust, slipping through her fingers. The weight of every stare bore down on her, waiting, daring her to fail. Seconds stretched into eternity, and then the gavel came down. "This case lacks sufficient legal standing," the judge declared, his voice final, cutting through the room like the crack of a whip. "The motion to dismiss is granted. The case is thrown out." Silence, then a shuffle of movement, the creak of wooden benches as people began to rise, the whispers of satisfaction and amusement. Emily couldn't move. The words rang in her ears over and over. "Case dismissed. Case dismissed. Case dismissed." Her hands fell from the podium, numb. Daniel smirked, closing his briefcase with a decisive snap. Whitaker, his co-counsel, stood gracefully, adjusting her blazer as if she had never doubted this outcome for a second. Emily felt the pressure of the moment crush her, felt the courtroom blur around her as she realized she had lost. Not just lost. She had been humiliated. By the time she stepped outside, the cold air hit her like a slap. She had barely made it down the courthouse steps before the cameras swarmed. "Emily, do you have a comment on the judge's ruling? Do you still believe you had a case? Will you be filing an appeal?" She couldn't answer. Her throat was too tight. She walked blindly, past the reporters, past the murmuring bystanders, past the echoes of laughter still ringing in her ears. By the time she reached home, her legs were shaking. She barely made it to her room before collapsing onto the bed, curling in on herself as the weight of failure crushed her completely. She had been so sure she could stand against them, so sure the truth would be enough. But it wasn't. They hadn't even let her fight. They had silenced her before she could even speak. Tears burned hot against her cheeks as she buried her face in her hands. "I was wrong. I was never good enough. I should have listened. I should have known." She had fought so hard. And for what? To be laughed at? To be dismissed like she was nothing? A soft knock at the door. She didn't answer. The door creaked open anyway, and a familiar weight settled beside her on the bed. For a long time, her father didn't speak. He simply sat there, quiet, steady. Then finally, "They wanted you to quit." His voice was low, calm, but there was something unbreakable in it. Emily didn't lift her head. "And they won." Marcus let out a slow breath. "Did they?" She squeezed her eyes shut. "I lost." "No," he said. "You were denied." Emily frowned, opening her eyes. "What's the difference?" Her father sighed, running a hand over his face. "The difference is that they never wanted to hear you in the first place. They didn't beat you, Emily. They silenced you." She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. His eyes were tired, but they still burned with something she had seen in him all her life: determination. "They want you to give up," he continued. "That's how they win. Not by arguing against you, not by proving you wrong, but by making you walk away." Emily swallowed hard. "And if I don't?" Marcus gave a small, tired smile. "Then they'll have to listen." She stared at him for a long time, the words settling into her bones, anchoring her. The fight wasn't over. She had lost a battle. But the war? The war was just beginning. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. But defeat wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The courtroom had silenced her, but the truth was still out there. Buried beneath years of deception, she just had to find it. And then, late one night, the phone rang in the dead of night. The sharp, jarring sound cut through the silence like a knife, pulling Emily from the restless haze of her thoughts. She had been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the humiliation of the courtroom over and over again. The words still echoed in her skull. This case lacks standing. Motion to dismiss granted. It didn't matter how much she had prepared. It didn't matter that she was right. They had shut her down before she even had a chance to fight. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, the glow of the screen illuminating a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, pulse quickening. She answered. At first there was only breathing, uneven, hesitant, as if the person on the other end was deciding whether or not to speak. Then a voice, low, urgent. "I have something you need to hear." Emily sat up, heart pounding. "Who is this?" "I work for the district," the voice said. "I shouldn't be calling you, but after what they did, after what they said in court, I couldn't stay quiet." Her grip on the phone tightened. "What are you talking about?" A pause, then, "They lied." A cold wave of dread washed over her. The voice continued, each word laced with something heavy, something dangerous. The admissions process, the rejection letters, the school board, they manipulate everything. They've been keeping Black students out of Oak Ridge for years, fabricating reasons to deny them entry. They change zoning laws, forge wait lists, falsify enrollment records. And when that's not enough, they lose applications. It's not incompetence. It's not a mistake. It's deliberate. Emily's breath caught. She had suspected it. Everyone had. But this wasn't just systemic bias. This was criminal. Her mind raced. Do you have proof? The voice hesitated. Then lower now, almost a whisper. I have recordings. Emily froze. The line crackled slightly and then she heard it. A file being played. At first static. Then voices. Familiar ones. Can't risk it. If we let them in, even a few of them, it opens the door for the rest. Emily's stomach twisted. Another voice. Sharper. Cold. Then we make sure they don't get in. A pause. How? We do what we've always done. We find a reason, a clerical error, a policy adjustment. If that doesn't work, we lose the application. We keep our numbers clean. Silence, then the final blow. We have to stop them by any means necessary. The audio cut off. Emily sat there gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. The room around her felt smaller, the walls pressing in. This wasn't speculation anymore. This wasn't just a fight against an unfair system. This was a conspiracy. She forced herself to speak, though her voice was barely above a whisper. Who was that? You know who, the voice said. The board, the district attorneys, the same people who sat across from you in court and laughed when the judge threw your case out. Emily swallowed hard. The courtroom had never been a fair fight. It had been rigged from the start. She clenched her jaw, her pulse thundering. I need those recordings. The voice hesitated. I can get them to you, but you need to be careful. If they find out someone leaked this, I don't care. She cut him off, fire rising in her chest. They think they can shut me up. They think they can bury this. She exhaled, steadying herself. They're wrong. A pause, then quietly. I'll be in touch. The line went dead. Emily sat in the darkness, the weight of what she had just heard settling deep into her bones. She had been fighting for fairness, fighting for Samantha, fighting for every kid like her who had been told no for reasons no one would admit. But this wasn't just about education anymore. This was corruption. This was a cover-up. This was war. The news broke like a thunderclap. Department of Justice opens federal investigation into discriminatory school admissions practices. The headline flashed across television screens, filled the front pages of newspapers, dominated social media feeds. What had started as a dismissed lawsuit, a case thrown out before it could even be heard, had now spiraled into something far beyond the control of those who had tried to bury it. The U.S. government had stepped in, and now the people who had smirked in the courtroom, who had dismissed Emily Taylor as nothing more than a naive child, were scrambling to protect themselves. Inside the school district offices, the atmosphere had turned from smug certainty to full-blown panic. Phone lines buzzed with frantic calls. Lawyers were summoned, meetings were hastily scheduled and then canceled just as quickly, replaced by private discussions held behind closed doors. The board members who had once spoken with such confidence about the integrity of their system were now whispering in hushed voices, their faces pale as they read through the subpoenas arriving at their desks. Richard Daniels, the district's chief legal counsel, sat in his office, his fingers drumming against the desk, his usual polished demeanor unraveling by the second. The words on the official DOJ letter in front of him seemed to pulse with accusation. The United States Department of Justice is hereby opening a formal investigation into allegations of systemic discrimination within the Oak Ridge School District. His throat felt dry. His assistant stood frozen in the doorway, her voice barely above a whisper. The Attorney General's office is on the line. They want a statement. Daniels clenched his jaw. A statement? What was he supposed to say? That they had been caught? That everything they had worked to keep hidden had come crashing down because of a teenage girl who refused to back down? Tell them I'll call back. The assistant hesitated. Sir, they said they won't wait. Daniels exhaled sharply. He could feel the walls closing in. Across town, Nancy Whitaker, the district's lead attorney, paced her office. Phone pressed against her ear as she listened to yet another frantic board member, demanding to know what the hell was happening. You told us this would go away, the voice on the other end snapped. You told us she was a child, an amateur, that we didn't have to worry. Whitaker pinched the bridge of her nose. I thought that was the case. until someone leaked those damn recordings. The recordings. The moment they had surfaced, everything had changed. Those words, "We have to stop them, by any means necessary," had detonated like a bomb, sending shock waves through the entire system. The very people who had insisted they were operating within the bounds of the law, who had dismissed every accusation of discrimination as baseless, had been caught on tape admitting to the truth. And now they weren't just facing lawsuits, they were facing prison. FBI agents arrived in unmarked cars, their presence a silent but undeniable force. Computers were confiscated, documents were seized. A quiet but deadly storm had descended on the offices of the Oak Ridge School District, and the people who had once wielded power so effortlessly were now being dragged under by the weight of their own corruption. Emily watched it all unfold from a distance, standing outside the courthouse where, just weeks ago, she had been humiliated, laughed at, dismissed like she was nothing. But she wasn't nothing. She had made them listen. She had forced the most powerful system in the country to acknowledge what so many had tried to ignore. And now those who had mocked her were the ones trembling. The battle wasn't over. The fight wasn't won. But the tide had turned. For the first time, they were afraid. The investigation had shattered the system's walls, exposing the corruption that had thrived in the shadows for decades. But uncovering the truth was only the beginning. Justice demanded more than just headlines and public outrage. It needed consequences. And as the courtroom filled once again, this time with the weight of undeniable evidence, those who had once wielded power with impunity were about to face the reckoning they never saw coming. The courtroom was silent, but the air was electric. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone inside. The lawyers, the press, the officials who had once believed they were untouchable. But no one felt it more than the man standing at the defense table, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. Richard Daniels, the district's chief legal counsel, had spent his entire career bending the system to his will, ensuring that people like Emily never got far enough to challenge him. But today, he wasn't the one in control. The gavel struck. "Mr. Daniels," Judge Carver said, his voice even but firm, "stand up." Daniels hesitated, his fingers tightening against the table's edge, as if he could hold on to his power if he just gripped hard enough. But there was no escape. "Stand up," the judge repeated. Slowly, reluctantly, Daniels rose to his feet. His suit, always pristine, now seemed to hang off him. His once confident posture slumped under the weight of what was about to happen. Across the room, two federal agents stepped forward. Emily watched as they approached, her heart pounding in her chest. "Richard Daniels," one of them said, voice clear and unwavering, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and multiple violations of civil rights law." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Daniels' face paled, his jaw clenched, his mind clearly scrambling for a way out. "This is ridiculous," he spat, his voice breaking. "I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Emily spoke now, stepping forward. "Your job was to keep students like me out of Oak Ridge. Your job was to silence us, to bury our futures under fake paperwork and legal loopholes." Daniels turned to her, his lips curling into a sneer, even as the agents pulled his arms behind his back. "You think you won?" he hissed. "You think this changes anything?" Emily met his glare without flinching. "I don't think I won, Mr. Daniels. I know I did." The sharp click of handcuffs snapped through the room. Daniels' face twisted with rage, but it was useless now. The system he had manipulated for so long had finally turned against him. As the agents led him toward the exit, Emily caught a glimpse of Nancy Whitaker standing by the defense table, her expression unreadable. For weeks, Whitaker had been Daniels' closest ally, fighting to keep the case buried, dismissing every argument Emily had made. But now there was no fight left in her. She reached for her briefcase, hands steady despite the chaos around her. And then, without a word, she turned to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, voice clipped but firm, "I am withdrawing as lead counsel for the defense." The courtroom exploded into murmurs. Judge Carver raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure, Ms. Whitaker?" She nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor, effective immediately." Emily watched as Whitaker gathered her papers, avoiding eye contact with Daniels as she stepped away. For the first time, the woman who had once laughed at Emily's case looked defeated. Daniels let out a bitter laugh as he was pulled toward the exit. "Coward," he spat under his breath. Whitaker didn't respond. She just walked out, disappearing through the side door like she had never been there at all. And just like that, the people who had stood against Emily had crumbled. The system had been built to keep people like her down, to make sure that students like Samantha never had a chance. But today, it had been forced to answer for its crimes. Emily exhaled slowly, then turned back toward the judge. "Miss Taylor," he said, his tone less condescending than it had been at the start of all this. "Do you have any final remarks before I issue my ruling?" She stepped forward, standing in the very spot where, just weeks ago, she had been dismissed and humiliated. But today, she wasn't just a girl standing alone against the system. She was the voice of every student who had ever been told no. She let the silence stretch for a moment, then lifted her chin. "If we don't fight today," she said, her voice strong, unshaken, "who will fight tomorrow?" The words hung in the air, pressing against every soul in the room, and this time, no one dared to interrupt her. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. The chamber was silent, yet the air crackled with anticipation. Every seat in the gallery was filled, lawmakers sitting upright, their faces unreadable as they stared toward the podium. The weight of history pressed down on the room, a slow, suffocating tension that had been building for months. Emily Taylor sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the quiet murmurs around her. She had stood in courtrooms, faced down some of the most powerful people in the system, fought against a machine designed to crush her. But this was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every student who had ever been locked out of a future they deserved. Across the chamber, the Speaker of the House adjusted the microphone. The rustling of papers ceased, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. Then finally, "We now move to vote on Bill 327, also known as the Emily Taylor Educational Equity Act." Emily inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening. The bill, the law that, just a year ago, would have been impossible. A law that would make sure no student was ever denied an education because of the color of their skin, because of where they lived, because of the silent, insidious barriers that had existed for generations. She had fought for this moment, and now it was here. The clerk stepped forward. "The vote will now commence." A hush fell over the chamber. The first vote was cast, then the second, then the third. Each name called, each response recorded, the tally shifting before her eyes. Emily barely breathed. She had faced so many obstacles, so many moments where it seemed like the system would win. The courtroom that had dismissed her, the school board that had tried to silence her, the threats, the humiliation, the losses. But none of it had stopped her. And now the system, the same system that had once turned its back on her, was deciding whether or not to acknowledge the fight she had waged. One by one, the votes came in. Yes, yes, no, yes, yes, yes. The tension in the room thickened. Emily's father sat beside her, his expression unreadable, but she could feel the tension in his posture. He had fought battles like this before. He knew how easily power could shift, how fragile a victory could be. The final votes rolled in. Then, the gavel struck. The bill has passed. For a moment, Emily didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, the words hit her like a tidal wave. It had passed. It had passed. The room erupted. Applause, cheers, the sound of history being written in real time. Emily felt the breath leave her lungs, felt the weight of it all crash into her at once. Her name, her fight, was now part of the law. Emily Law had been born. She had won. But more importantly, so had every student who would come after her. The world didn't change overnight. Emily knew that. She had fought too long, endured too much, to believe that one victory could undo generations of injustice. But something was different now. She could see it in the schools, in the classrooms, in the faces of the students who had once been told no and were now finally hearing yes. It was in the textbooks, no longer outdated, no longer crumbling at the edges like forgotten relics of a system that had never cared. It was in the teachers, new hires, more diverse, more determined, pushing students forward instead of letting them slip through the cracks. And most of all, it was in the students themselves. They walked the halls of Oak Ridge Academy now, Black students, Latino students, students who had been pushed aside for so long that they had stopped believing a place like this could ever belong to them. Now they sat in the same classrooms as those who had once been handed every advantage. Now they had a shot, a real one. Emily saw it firsthand when she visited Jefferson Elementary. She hadn't planned on stopping by, hadn't thought she'd have the time, but something pulled her there. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was something deeper. The school looked the same as she remembered. Same faded brick walls, same squeaky doors, same old swings that groaned under the weight of time. But there was something different, something she could feel in the air. Hope. As she walked through the halls, teachers smiled at her. Some nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Others simply watched as if trying to match the girl in the headlines with the young woman walking their floors. Then a small voice called out behind her, "Excuse me." Emily turned. A little girl, no older than 10, stood in the hallway, clutching her backpack straps tightly. Her bright eyes were filled with something Emily recognized instantly: determination. "You're Emily Taylor, right?" Emily knelt slightly so they were eye level. "I am." The girl's face lit up. "Because of you, my school is better." Emily felt something tighten in her chest. She had spent so long fighting, so long pushing forward, that she had barely stopped to see what had truly changed. But here it was, not in courtrooms, not in legal battles. In this little girl, standing before her, knowing she belonged. Emily smiled, her voice steady. "And because of you," she said softly, "it will keep getting better." Emily stood outside, the cool night air brushing against her skin as she looked up at the endless stretch of sky. The stars burned bright, distant, and untouchable, yet constant. A reminder that no matter how dark the night seemed, light always found a way through. She had won. The law had passed. The people who had tried to silence her had fallen. The children who had once been locked out of opportunity now walked through open doors. But even as she stood there, feeling the weight of everything she had fought for, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The fight wasn't over. Injustice didn't vanish because of one victory. Corruption didn't crumble overnight. There would always be those who tried to rewrite history, who tried to twist laws in their favor, who found new ways to shut people out. Emily knew that, and she also knew this. She wouldn't stop fighting. Not now. Not ever. Because if she had given up after her first defeat, none of this would have happened. If she had let the fear, the threats, the humiliation break her, nothing would have changed. And if she stopped now, someone else would be forced to start all over again. She clenched her fists, inhaling deeply, letting the fire in her chest burn hotter. She wouldn't stop. Because there were still voices waiting to be heard. There were still walls left to tear down. There were still people in power who needed to be held accountable. And if she had learned anything through this journey, it was that one person could make a difference. She turned to the camera, eyes fierce, voice steady. "This isn't just my fight. It never was. This is about justice, about making sure no one else has to go through what we did. And that fight doesn't end just because we've won one battle." She took a step closer, the intensity in her gaze unwavering. "So if you believe in what we're fighting for, if you believe in justice, in truth, in standing up when the system tells you to sit down, then don't let this be the end." Her voice sharpened, filled with conviction. "Like, share, subscribe, spread this message, because the more people who see this, the louder our voices become. And if enough of us stand together," she lifted her chin, a small, knowing smile forming, "they can't ignore us anymore." The screen faded to black, but the fight continued. Justice is not a given. It is not something handed down by those in power. It is something that must be fought for, demanded, and defended, again and again by those brave enough to stand up when the system tells them to sit down. Emily's story is not just her own. It is the story of every child who has been told they are not good enough, of every family who has been denied a fair chance, of every voice that has been silenced before it could even be heard. She fought because she had no other choice. Because if she didn't, who would? But her battle was only one chapter in a war that is far from over. Corruption does not disappear just because the light has been shined on it. Those who abuse power do not simply step aside when exposed. They regroup. They find new ways to push people like Emily down. They rewrite the rules, move the goalposts, and wait for the world to stop paying attention. We can't let that happen. This fight is bigger than one girl, bigger than one courtroom, bigger than one law. This is about justice for all of us. This is about making sure that no one else has to go through what Emily did, that no child is ever denied their future because of where they come from or what they look like, that the system built to protect us actually does. But for that to happen, people need to care. People need to listen. People need to act. So if you believe in this fight, if you believe in justice, in truth, in standing up when the world tries to keep you down, then make your voice heard. Like, share, subscribe, spread this message. Because the more people who see this, the harder it becomes for those in power to pretend we don't exist. Emily stood up. Now the question is, will you?